The United States President Woodrow Wilson, back in 1919, described a uniquely powerful weapon. He said it was something more tremendous than war, that creates absolute isolation, that brings a nation to its senses just as suffocation removes from the individual all inclinations to fight. Apply this economic, peaceful, silent, deadly remedy, and there will be no need for force. It is a terrible remedy. What he was describing was the use of economic sanctions, something that's often been referred to as the economic weapon. And we're seeing the most recent case of this with Russia as a response to their invasion of Ukraine. But this is a case unlike any other. In the past 2 decades, only 3 countries have had the extreme measure of having their central bank assets frozen: Iran, Venezuela, and Afghanistan. But as the 11th largest economy in the world, the situation with Russia is on a totally different level. Whether it's being kicked out of SWIFT, freezing the assets of the central bank, barring trade, freezing the assets of oligarchs, all of this is intended to hurt the Russian economy, with the idea that this conflict then becomes too costly for Russia to continue. But there have been a lot of really vocal critics of this approach, claiming that this is too light of a response and that military involvement is what's needed. But the idea that economic sanctions is a passive response is simply not true, and it completely misses what history shows us. Nicholas Mulder, an expert on sanctions, says in his very detailed book, The Economic Weapon, if we compare the 3 major anti-civilian weapons of the interwar period, air power, gas warfare, and economic blockade, it becomes clear that blockade was by far the deadliest. In World War I, 300,000 to 400,000 people died of blockade-induced starvation and illness in Central Europe, with an additional 500,000 deaths in the Ottoman provinces of the Middle East, affected by the Anglo-French blockade. Before World War II, these hundreds of thousands of deaths by economic isolation were the chief man-made cause of civilian death in 20th century conflict. Now, although it's doubtful that this situation will be as extreme as that, we can already see how the economic measures are affecting the Russian economy. For a start, JP Morgan has estimated that the economy will shrink by 35% in Q2 and 7% for the full year, and S&P have been even less conservative than that in anticipating a decline of 22% for the year. But the big question is whether all of this will actually stop Russia continuing their war. Nicholas Mulder questions this. He suggests that history shows us different measures are needed because sanctions have a really poor record for stopping military situations. In the 20th century, only 3 out of 19 attempts to use sanctions to stop war have been successful, and 2 of those were due to the threat of sanctions rather than the actual application of them. If we look at a comparable situation, back in 1935, Mussolini's Italy was the 7th biggest economy in the world, and the League of Nations imposed sanctions on them for their invasion of Ethiopia. But the measures didn't achieve their goal of ending the invasion. But obviously that was a very different time. It's different to what we're seeing now in the modern world. But whatever happens, one thing is clear. The Russian economy is now facing a rather uncertain future, and some analysts have even taken the extreme view that this could be the downfall of Russia in a similar way to the Soviet Union. Now, there are some parallels, but Russia is a very different country. But one particular concern is that Russia could be heading towards a sovereign debt crisis. A sovereign debt crisis is when the government of a country is unable or unwilling to pay the debt that they owe, including any interest payments. For Russia, as recently as February, their government bonds were considered to be investment grade, which means that they're supposed to be relatively low risk for investors. Now, obviously, there are problems with investing in a country like Russia. For example, it's not exactly a secret that there's a high level of corruption. Mega yachts aren't just going to buy themselves, you know. But reasons like that mean that investors can demand a higher rate of interest as opposed to, for example, US treasuries, because the US is seen to have stronger political institutions. However, Russia had strong revenues from their commodities exports and a relatively low amount of debt for an economy of that size. So this meant that investors were led to think that they wouldn't have any sort of problem servicing their debt. However, with that being said, estimates suggest that bondholders bought over $6 billion in credit default swaps just before the invasion started, perhaps as a result of the build-up of troops on the border. And Amundi estimates that in just week 2 of the war, that could have already risen to as high as $50 billion worth. Now, credit default swaps, they're like an insurance on the bond. They pay out in the event of a default. But the process now may be a bit more complicated because with sanctions in place, it may be that they can't pay out at all anyway. So let's take a look at some of the numbers. This year, Russia is due to repay $4.7 billion in principal and interest payments on their government debt. Now, this shouldn't really be a problem. Over the past few years, they've built up a war chest worth around $640 billion, although asset freezes have cut this roughly in half to an estimated $300 billion. So considering they only have $40 billion of debt, of which around $28 billion is held by foreign investors, $300 billion should be more than enough to cover it. So at least in theory, Russia has plenty of reserves to cover their debt and money shouldn't be the big problem at the moment. Sanctions are where all of this becomes a bit more uncertain because they raise some questions about whether or not Russia could even legally send bond payments to the US for them to be processed in the first place. So far, a number of bondholders have publicly said that they have been receiving the payments in the correct currency, therefore avoiding a default for now. And this is largely thanks to a special clause within the sanctions known as General License Number 9A, issued by OFAC. And what this does is it allows repayments of debt that were issued before the 24th of February to be repaid up until the 25th of May. The next bond payments after that are due on the 27th of May, and that could be the first real test of whether Russia is about to default. The thing is though, these are debts that have obviously already been issued, and so it could be in the interest of the US Treasury to extend the deadline. After all, this is only going to hurt investors outside of Russia, and it would also help to drain Russia's war chest a bit. So if it does get extended, then Russia's access to US dollars could be the next problem. Russia needs their central bank and commercial banks to source US dollars, but sanctions have been put on many of Russia's top banks, including the central bank, so that makes that job a bit harder. Now, in an effort to avoid currency outflows, the Russian government has already implemented capital controls that limit the amount of foreign currency leaving the country. Now, as we previously mentioned, Russia has got this big war chest, and they are still receiving dollars for oil and gas and other exports. But they did say that they will pay in rubles to avoid any possible situation of not being able to pay their bonds. And they can do that with some bonds, but with others, they have to be paid in dollars or euros. And if they do try to pay in rubles, then that's a technical default. So because of these potential problems, two big rating agencies, Fitch and S&P, quickly downgraded Russia's debt to just above the bottom of their rating scales, and Fitch have said that a default is imminent. All this talk of Russia defaulting is probably creating flashbacks for any market veterans that remembers the crisis back in '98 that rippled through the markets. In particular, you may remember Long-Term Capital Management, LTCM. They were a huge hedge fund that was leveraged up on Russian assets, and it sort of helped trigger their wipeout. The whole situation became this concern for the stability of the global financial system. And there's a really, really good book that you can read about it called When Genius Failed. I think it's one of the most interesting financial markets books around, so definitely pick up that one. However, things are very different today. Since 2014, after the annexation of Crimea, sanctions have already been limiting what financial institutions can do in Russia. And most investors holding Russian government bonds are likely to be doing so as part of a portfolio in emerging markets. So it's likely that they're being held only in relatively small amounts for the overall portfolio. Now, at least relatively speaking, on the surface, the global financial system doesn't appear to be as exposed as it was back in '98. There's a lot less leverage on Russian assets, for example. And according to the IMF, it would not be systemically relevant. But that doesn't mean it's not going to hurt. We've seen announcements from some major players such as BlackRock, who already expect to lose billions, and as well as that, there may be areas where problems appear which we just don't know about yet. For bondholders, the whole thing looks like it's going to be a very messy situation, and there may be no easy way out apart from just accepting the loss. According to Jay Newman, a former hedge fund manager who specializes in sovereign debt, Russia has sovereign immunity from lawsuits, which means that although the bonds are covered by English law, they aren't going to submit to any courts. Anyone trying to take them to court are likely to end up spending a lot more money in litigation fees, and even if they got to court, Russia could just not pay anyway. Although doing something like that would basically cut them off from global financing in the future and would be rather short-term thinking for the Kremlin, as they wouldn't be allowed to raise any new money, any new debt, until a deal had been worked out on existing lenders. Although Russia could maybe rely on financing from China, similar to what Venezuela did. For now, while sanctions are in place, debt restructuring seems impossible for Russia, and so any default will likely have to wait to be sorted until after the war in Ukraine is over and perhaps Western governments agree to remove sanctions. But it's not just the Russian economy and investors who are at risk or suffering. Since Russia is a major commodity supplier, the sanctions are having and will continue to have knock-on effects for the global economy, which will lead to rises in inflation. Additionally, Russia's currency devaluation is negatively impacting the Central Asian republics whose currencies are linked with the ruble. As Mulder points out, sanctions are no longer this scalpel-like instrument that they may have been before, and they can have a lasting effect on globalization. Because of this, the unintended political and economic effects can quickly spiral out of control. And in order to avoid that happening, it needs to be made clear right now exactly what the conditions are for the removal of sanctions if de-escalation can take place. While sanctions, or the threat of sanctions, may work on smaller states, it's previously backfired against authoritarian states who are powerful enough to challenge major powers. Mulder explains that it may have even prompted the Nazis to secure resources by any means possible, therefore contributing another factor to the outbreak of World War II, and therefore causing an escalatory spiral rather than avoiding it. Now, hopefully this current situation won't be heading down that same route, and de-escalation with Russia can be achieved before any desperate countermeasures are taken. But as history shows, sanctions may be effective at punishing an economy and punishing civilians, but they haven't been so effective at ending the war.